It's December 23rd, and we have people are getting geared up for December 25th. Families getting together, parties, sharing of gifts, all kinds of things are going on during this time. There's, as I was sitting in a Sunday school class this past week, one of the ladies opened up and she said, I think everybody knows that Jesus wasn't born on December 25th. And then everybody just went along with, well, that's when we're going to celebrate it, et cetera. But this one lady was really, you could just see she was wanting to say something more. But the peer pressure and what other people think is so significant. And really what it comes down to, and this is my inability to foster enough wisdom or to have been seeking the Father enough in regards to this topic, that I really don't know how to address people. I don't know how to bridge the subject. I don't know how to do it in a way that's like a sharp scalpel and it's a perfect cut rather than using a butter knife and trying to do surgery. It's my skill set sometimes is just too sloppy. And this is what I find with people in general. As we were reading through Maccabees, First Maccabees chapter 1 through 5 today at the kitchen table here at Faith Works, we reviewed everything when it was all said and done. And we were looking at what Antiochus Epiphanes, who, as I wrote in the study this morning, Antiochus Epimanes. Epimanes in Hebrew is the word for a madman. That's really what he was. He was not the manifestation of God, Epiphany. He was Epimanes. He was a madman, thinking to himself to be something that he actually wasn't, God incarnate. And so as we were going through, we could put all the blame on Antiochus Epiphanes and the Greek culture that was influencing the Hebrews to assimilate and become part of that culture. But really, that's not where the blame belongs. As we got to chapter 4 into chapter 5, and we specifically chapter 5, we noticed that, oh my stars, God's people are fighting against each other. And they were fighting against each other in relationship to those who had become Hellenized, conforming to the Greek culture, with those who refused to fight or refused to be able to submit to the Greek culture. And there was a battle between the two, and they hated each other. And you know, that's the reality of where we are today. You've got individuals, and oftentimes in our immaturity, we don't know how to respond to people when it comes to the Torah because we haven't spent enough time in prayer, enough time asking, enough time communicating with one another to sharpen one another. I call it the Mormon syndrome. If we were more like the Mormons, and what we did is every day we purposefully tried to share our faith, and then every night we came and we talked together and we shared our experiences, and then we helped one another get better in communicating, then we probably wouldn't find this spinning our wheels in the mud so much. And it's difficult. And so what happens is we know the right position, we don't know how to communicate it. So it ends up becoming a bloodbath and a war. And then we become isolated, and then we feel hyper spiritual and look at us. And they're trying to say it's not that big of a deal. It's not that big of a deal. You've got to get along with the world. How do you maintain holiness? What a challenge. What a challenge we've got. And so this time of year, it's very challenging for everybody. Now tonight, what I want to do is I want to share with you, it could be one of the most important truths I've ever shared with you. Literally ever shared with you. And in my personal opinion, every study we've had, God allows us to at least hit singles, but sometimes we've hit it out of the park, and God has just spoken to us based on the preliminary conversations prior to the time of the teaching, and then Yahweh directs us to where whatever's being said penetrates the hearts directly. So it's one of those things that as I look at this, I go, Father, just take tonight, speak to us, and then give me, I'm talking about me, because I was praying about this for me earlier. I need to conform my life to it. I need to make sure that I'm putting into practice these things. If you don't do it, then guess what? It's just intellectual fodder. That's it. It's just intellectual fodder. I've got to become a doer of the word and not just a hearer, as James chapter 1 says, and then later on in James chapter 2. Okay, so I'm gonna emphasize to you, I'm gonna run through 3 passages real quick in Romans, and I'm gonna go over to the book of Romans. I'm gonna go to Romans chapter 8, and I'm gonna set the stage for you. And the stage for you is found in Romans chapter 8, verses 28 and 29. Now, if I was going to ask you to either quote for me or ask you, do you know this verse? Then I'll guarantee you every hand would go up and say, yeah. So Romans 8:28 says, and we know that all things work together for the good to those who love God, to those who are the called according to his purpose. Now, we know that verse. But do we know that verse? I would say we don't. And the reason why I'd say we don't is because we have such little patience when it comes to time and God's timing to show we know that all things work together for the good. Now, I need to define for you, for your notes, the word good. The word in Hebrew is the word tov. If you're writing it for your notes, it would be T-O-V, tov. And what it means is the word good just doesn't mean, oh, that's good. Oh, he's such a good boy. Or you know what, that colonic went so good today. Or that doctor's appointment went so good today. Or you know what, my car handled so well in the snow. It was so good. Now, we use the terms, but we don't really think about what we're saying. So when God looked at day 1 and he said it was good, day 2, he didn't say it was good. Day 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7, he said good, 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 and very good. What did he really mean by it was good? Well, when your words match up with your actions, and your actions are functional according to the word, that's the definition of good. So I could speak about something, but I don't do it. That's not good. To be good, to be tov, when Yeshua says to the servant who had 5 talents and doubled his 5 talents, he called him good and faithful servant. Good because he was producing a functional action which was matching the word. So when it was evaluated, it could be said to be good. If my action doesn't match the word, then it's not good. And we know that all things work together for the good to those who love God, to those who are the called according to his purpose. So now I have to say, well, what does it mean to love God? Well, Yeshua told us clearly in John 14:15, he says, if you love me, then you'll keep my commandments. And if we continue to keep reading in John chapter 14, verses 21 through 23, He tells us that if I demonstrate my love towards God, then God will reciprocate and he'll show even more revelation of who he is, which gives me the opportunity to put into practice more of my behavioral changes towards him, which allows him to be able to show more, and it never stops. But we become so inundated with just using the right catchphrases and being, sounding in a certain way, but when things aren't matching up with the word. And the whole purpose for everything working out for the good is verse 29, so that we would be conformed to the image of his dear son. At the end of the day, I have to go back and I have to ask myself a question, and I do this every night. I went back to the cabin earlier, to the cottage, and I asked myself the question, looking back through the day, did I represent Yeshua? Did I keep the scriptures in my mind? Did I respond? Did I love? Did I serve? Did I give my best effort? What did I do today? Did I let my light shine? Was it evident? Was I matching up the word with my actions? Could somebody say it was a good day? Not a good day like nothing went wrong, a good day like, was I functional according to the word? And I have to go back and I have to evaluate. Now, what's important to understand is that in Romans chapter 8, verse 28, that all the preceding verses 1 through 27, they all deal with conflict. They all deal with a battle and recognizing that battle. See, when I wake up in the morning, I know there's potential for conflict in the day. I know it. When conflict comes in the day, I have to recognize I've prepared myself for any type of conflict, whether it's brought on by myself, by my inadequacies, or not brought on by myself. But the question is not whether I'm going to have conflict, which is what Romans chapter 8, verses 1 through 27 is all about, but how do I respond? Knowing that if I love God, that everything's going to work out for the good and for his purpose. For me to be conformed to the image of his dear son, because he's calling me to something higher. I want you to flip over a couple of pages and go to chapter 10. Now in chapter 10, verse 4, the scripture emphasizes, the apostolic scripture says, for Christ is the goal of the law to everyone who believes. Now notice what this says. What Paul is doing is he's writing the church at Rome. He's going to be quoting from Deuteronomy chapter 30. And he's emphasizing that there's two different types of people out there within the churches, within the synagogues, within the religious system. There's the people who are, they are zealous. They're passionate for God, but they have no knowledge of the Torah. They don't have a walk. Yes, they've got it here, but they don't have it here. That's the first 3 verses. Then in verse 4, he says, for Christ, the Mashiach, the Messiah, he is the purpose of the law. He's the end goal of the law. So if I want to live out the Torah like Matthias did, or Judah Maccabees did, or those who chose to follow and to stand up against Antiochus Epiphanes, or those who chose to stand up against the Greek culture, then I need to have something that I'm striving to become. And what I'm striving to become is to become conformed to the image of his dear son, which is the goal of the law to everyone who believes. That's what he says in verse 4. It's the goal of the law for righteousness to everyone who believes. So if I want to know that I'm living righteously, then the goal of the law is to actually live out the law. And when I live that out according to Romans chapter 6, so we looked at chapter 8, we're in chapter 10. Now, the goal of the law for righteousness to everyone who believes is found in Romans chapter 6. It gives you a progression that if I'm choosing to die to self, I'm choosing to live for him, to walk in newness of life, in resurrection power, to be obedient. Obedience will produce an action, and that obedience that produces an action is called the fruit of righteousness. And the fruit of righteousness will produce holiness, a separation from the things of the world. And the fruit of holiness will produce a reward, and that reward is everlasting life. And if you go back to Romans chapter 6 and you look at the progression, just pick up from verse 4 and go through the progression and notice that those who've been baptized, we have one of two choices to make. We have a choice. We can either choose the path of obedience or we can choose the path of disobedience. We can either choose to walk in the Torah, which is life, or we can choose to walk contrary to the Torah, which is death. And what will happen when you walk through the progressions is that the gift that God will give to you is life for the coming age versus the wages of sin, which according to 1 John chapter 3, verse 4, the wages of sin, the transgression of the Torah, is death. So I get to make this choice every day when things are going good, when things are not going good. I get to make the choice. Now, when you're in chapter 10, the goal of the law for righteousness to everyone who believes is to imitate the Messiah, to serve, to give, to pray, to love, to teach, to correct, to build up, to tear down. There's all of these characteristics. So when you look at the life of Yeshua, our coming Messiah, then you begin to recognize, oh, wow, that's how the Torah is applied. Now, if you jump over a couple more pages and you go to chapter 15, chapter 15, specifically verse 4, he says, the Apostle Paul says, for whatever things were written aforetime were written for our learning, that we through patience and comfort of the scriptures, we might have hope. Now, I can tell you one thing for sure. The Apostle Paul never intended his letters to the church at Ephesus or Galatia or Colossae or Thessalonica or any of his letters or John in the book of Revelation, they never looked at their letters as being scripture, ever. Never. I call them apostolic scriptures because they're his letters. The scriptures are found in Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. Even the prophets are not just the scriptures, they're the commentary on the scriptures of what happened with people who are obedient versus disobedient. The Apostle Paul's letters are for those who are obedient or disobedient, commentary. So if I'm looking at every story that was written aforetime, written before, and it was written for my learning, that through the scriptures and through the patience of walking out the scriptures, then I'll have hope. Now, hope is not something that I can cling to because it doesn't have any substance. Hope is the promise of what God says about something, though I haven't received it, but I line myself up with that truth in order to obtain it in a coming day. The question is, when? And this is the challenge that we all face. I made the comment to you earlier. This teaching tonight could very well be the most important teaching that I've given to you, if you listen carefully, because I'm going to encourage you through the story of Joseph. So I'm going to take you back to Genesis chapter 37. Now, in last week's Torah portion, we were studying out, beginning in Genesis chapter 37, we introduced the story of Joseph. And as we did in the Torah portion, Vayeshev, and he dwelt, we started unpacking this journey of Joseph. I've shared with you, and I've gone over this in past years, but I've shared with you how there's at least 100 specific realities of comparison between Joseph and Yeshua. And if I'm supposed to be imitating Yeshua, then I might want to learn about Joseph and understand, how did Joseph deal with life? One of the things about Joseph is this, is that God was with him. And we talked about this on Shabbat. But I want to show you something that kind of just goes, whoosh, it flies right over our heads. When Joseph was sold, look at chapter 37 and look at verse 25. I'm going to make a statement for you, and this statement is going to be really important for you to get a hold of. If you can get a hold of this statement, and you can implement this statement when you go to bed tonight, you implement this statement when you wake up in the morning, and you implement this statement with you no matter what you're going through, you'll come out on the other side obtaining the goal, the righteousness for those who believe. Here's what verse 25 says. And they sat down to eat bread, and they had just thrown Joseph in the pit. They threw him in the pit. Here's Joseph screaming and yelling, and the boys walk a good distance away, probably over a hill, and then they start eating bread. So at a distance, so they can't hear Joseph. A distance far enough to where Reuben's able to come back and look into the pit with the boys without the boys even knowing. A distance far enough away to where they didn't see the Midianite traders come and take them out of the pit and then sell them to the Ishmaelites who sold them to Potiphar. So they're a distance away because they don't want to hear the screaming. It's really funny how we do this. We do something to one another, and then we don't want to face the music. We don't want to come clean. We don't want to listen. We just want to avoid everything. We have this tendency, this fear, because we're not quite sure why we did it. Was it beneficial? I know, been there, done that, got the t-shirt hanging in my closet. He goes on and he says, they sat down to eat bread and lifted up their eyes and looked, and behold, a company of Ishmaelites came from Gilead with their camels bearing spicery, balm, and myrrh. Those are three specific things that I want to draw your attention to. Now, if we studied out Ishmaelite traders and we went back in history, we would find that Ishmaelite traders don't carry beautiful, fragrant things like the spicery, the balm, and the myrrh. That's not the focal point of their travels. They would carry things that are stinky, furs and all kinds of different things. Animal products, not things that are fragrant. Why in the world would I bring this up to you? Here's point number one for tonight. Point number one for tonight is pay close attention in your life. When you're going through a very, very difficult time, Joseph is on his way to Potiphar's house. He's been sold from the Midianites to the Ishmaelites to Potiphar's house. And what God does is God makes his presence known by providing for him a sweet fragrance. You say, what? Here's what I want you to write down for your notes. You do this, and you'll never be bitter. You do this, you won't live in anger. You don't do this and enjoy spinning your wheels. If you will look for the sweet fragrance that God provides in the midst of your most difficult situation, you'll see God and you won't see your situation. It's this reality of the wonderful spices, the balm and the myrrh, and the fragrance that Joseph's enjoying as he's going into a situation that he doesn't understand. If you can do that in your life, you know what I used to do, and I'd encourage you to do it if you don't do it, you take a 3x5 card and you make a special note on it. And the special note might say something like, think back to the most difficult times in your life and ask, Lord, reveal to me the spicery, the balm, and the myrrh, the sweet fragrance of your presence. And when you begin to look into your life for his presence during those times, the stench of the circumstances goes away because of his presence with you. If this were me, which I've done, I would put a 3x5 card and I'd put it in my pocket and I'd check it all throughout the day. And I'd say, wow, in the midst of this, am I looking for God's sweet fragrance? What is God's sweet fragrance at this moment? What is God's sweet fragrance at work? What is God's sweet fragrance with governmental decisions? What is the sweet fragrance here in my relationships? What is the sweet fragrance? Just name it. When you start to look for the sweet fragrance of God's presence, because this is not necessary for me to know. This is nothing in the story. This is not significant to the story. But when I see this in the story and I go, why, oh, why would God make sure that that's in the story? Because he wants us to know something. And that something is important for me to glean and to grab a hold of. So let's begin there. Then the second thing that I want to do is I want to ask you a question. Now, I want you to take your specific moment of rejection. Just make a little note. When do you feel that you were rejected? When do you feel that you didn't measure up? When did you feel like you were misunderstood? When did you feel that you weren't cared for? Well, if you're like me, you could probably go, well, this and that and this and that and this and that and over and over and over again. If I took the time to do it, which I have, then I could come up with a long laundry list. Now, what I want you to understand is that, remember the verse that we started out with in Romans chapter 8, verse 28? And we know that all things work together for the good to them that love God, to those who are the called according to his purpose. Many are called, but few are chosen. How do I work out my salvation with fear and trembling? Philippians chapter 2, verses 12 and 13. How do I work that out? Well, I'll guarantee you, it starts with you looking for the spicery and for the balm and for the myrrh while you're going down into Egypt. And remember, Egypt is that tight spot where you're just going, oh, I just feel so constricted. I don't even know what to do. Now I'm going to take you over to 2 Corinthians, and I'm going to warn you about something. And this warning is really, really important. 2 Corinthians chapter 10, verses 3 through 5. Now, this is going to be important for you in relationship to understanding what I need to know to be able to make it through whatever I'm going through unscathed. 2 Corinthians chapter 10, verses 3 through 5, the Apostle Paul is saying, for though we walk in the flesh, we do not war after the flesh. Now, if you go back and you compare 2 Corinthians chapter 10, verse 3 with Romans chapter 8, the battle between the flesh and the spirit, then you'll be able to get a little bit more insights. But that's something you have to do on your own time. You can't just say, oh, yeah, that's a great thought. You have to take your notes. You've got to go back and examine it and ask the Lord to speak to you. Verse 4, for the weapons of our warfare are not carnal, but mighty through God to the pulling down of strongholds. The question is, what are the strongholds? If I'm honest with you, I would be able to tell you that in my life, I have strongholds. Everybody's got them. I don't know anybody who doesn't have them. Even if you are a super duper spiritual, righteous, holy roller, you've still got strongholds. They might be blind spots that you don't see, but other people see them in you. Now the question is, do I have my ears open? Do I have my eyes open to the love and the compassion that other people are displaying towards me so that I can know what those really are? So the purpose for these weapons, not in the carnal, not in the fleshly, are for the pulling down specifically the pulling down of strongholds. So what is a stronghold? It's a picture of a city. And when a city is surrounded by an enemy, then they are trapped and they don't know what to do. Now he explains to me what these strongholds are in verse 5. He says, casting down imaginations and every high thing that exalts itself against the knowledge of God, and bringing into captivity every thought to the obedience of Christ. That's a mouthful. And though many of you may have that already memorized, that verse, or if you don't, it's probably a good verse to memorize, then this verse is saying, okay, these strongholds are found in my imagination, and they need to be pulled down. Because what they're doing is my imagination is creating this picture in my mind that's exalting itself against the mature knowledge of my walk in Christ. That's what he says. And so what I have to do is I have to bring every thought into captivity. So I'm going to give you a clue before we go into the story of Joseph again. I have to monitor my thoughts. I have to monitor my thoughts. I need to know if the thoughts that I have, are they my imaginations or are they real? I need to know that if it's my imagination and I'm thinking about something that's not necessarily showing reality, or it could kind of sort of be showing reality, but my imagination makes it bigger than what it really is, I need to pull those dudes down because they're rising up and hindering me from moving forward. It's a big wall that's hindering me. And what I need to do is I need to bring my thoughts captive to the obedience of Christ, which takes me back to Romans chapter 6. So now if I understand this, now I'm going to give you the next point for tonight. Take your situation that you're in And 9 times out of 10, probably 99 out of 100, my imagination runs wild in relationships. It's in relationships. What is he thinking? What is she thinking? What are they thinking? What are their thoughts? Why do they do that? Why do they ignore me? Why are they not listening? What? You name it. And the imagination runs wild. So I have to take my thoughts captive and I have to say, is there any validity for that? If there's not, let it be like water on a duck's back. But what we do is we take that imagination, listen very carefully. We take that imagination and our mind goes back in history to prove that point so that I can feel justified at the moment. It's devastating. Let's take Joseph. Let's go back to Genesis. And let's go to, in Genesis chapter 41, which is the beginning of this week's Torah portion, Miketz. Chapter 41, verse 1 says, and it came to pass at the end of 2 full years that Pharaoh dreamed, and behold, he stood up by the river. 2 full years from what? Remember, and we know that all things work together for the good to them that love God, to those who are the called according to his purpose. Remember, the term good has to do with purpose, action that is purposeful, action that matches up with the Word of God. When my actions match up with the Word of God, purposefully the Word of God is internalized and then purposefully applied into my life. God says that's good. If my actions don't match up with the Word of God, it's not good. And personally, I want to hear good and faithful servant. It's not faithful servant without good. It's good and faithful servant. You have to be declared good first. That's important. And the only way that I'm going to be deemed good on a coming day is if my life is being conformed to the image of his dear son, recognizing that the goal of the Torah is for me to be like him. The goal of the Torah is to be like the Messiah, to walk in righteousness to everyone who believes. If I can do that, then I don't have to be fearful on the day of judgment, from 1 John chapter 4, verses 16 through 19. I don't have to be afraid of the judgment. In fact, I can look forward to that. But if I'm not, and I'm not saying what so-and-so thinks or what so-and-so's evaluation of me is, it's what God's evaluation is of me. And if God's evaluation of me is that way, then I don't have to worry about men's. And I'm going to take the rest of this week in our morning studies to solidify this for you. Because in my opinion, going into this 2025 year, this fiscal year, we're going to have to be doers of the word like we've never been before. We're going to have to be wiser than we've ever been before. We're going to have to do what we need to do more than ever before. We're going to have to be conformed to the image of his dear son. You know, Suzanne and Joseph and I and Ashling, we go up to the weight room up at the community college. You know, we go up there and it's not like we're maxed out and we're pumping iron and we look like, you know, Hulk Hogan or Mr. Universe or anything like that. But you know what? Because we always have a goal to get better every day. We get better every day. Could you imagine if I did that spiritually? Could you imagine if I did that at my job? Could you imagine if I did that in my relationships? Could you imagine if I did that in my communication? And it's not based on what anybody else does towards me. It's about if I'm willing to do it. What a difference that would end up making. So in chapter 41, at the end of 2 years, it's been 2 years since Joseph told the dream to the butler and the baker. It's now been 13 years since he was taken out of the pit, bought by the Midianites, sold to the Ishmaelites, and then sold to Potiphar. It's been 13 years. When's something going to work out for good? We live in such a fast-paced society that if we don't have something fall into place immediately, we go into freak out mode. I'm telling you, speaking of me, myself, and I'm going, okay, yeah, when, God, when? Come on, time's ticking. He goes, you got some growing to do, buddy. At the end of 2 years, Miketz, it says, the Pharaoh dreamed, and behold, he stood by the river. Don't you find it strange that God's timing of giving Pharaoh a dream was at the right time when Joseph, who the Lord had been with him all of this time, and he knew the Lord was with him all this time, and we never hear him complaining about being put in prison. We never hear him complaining about anything. The text omits it. Why? Why does it omit it? Because when I know the Lord is with me, the physical circumstances are less important than me anticipating and looking for the spicery and the sweet fragrance of the balm and the myrrh. When I'm looking for his presence and his fragrance, the circumstances mean less. But if I get overwhelmed, and this is my choice, if I get overwhelmed by the circumstance because I forget that God would never put anything on me that I can't handle, and that with the things that are too hard for me to handle, he provides a way of escape. 1 Corinthians chapter 10, verse 12 and 13. If I know that, and I have that in my mind, that no matter what I'm facing, I know that he's with me, and I know that his fragrance is real. But if I allow my imagination to run wild, it exalts itself and it hinders me from walking with him. And if it hinders me from walking with him, oh, oy vey, I'm up a creek without a paddle. So Pharaoh has a dream. Isn't it amazing, God's timing? It wasn't Joseph. It was Pharaoh's dream. Why didn't Pharaoh have the dream 2 years ago? Why didn't Pharaoh have the dream 11 years ago? Why didn't Pharaoh have the dream immediately when he was put into Potiphar's house? Because Joseph had to get ready. The world had to get ready. Judah had to get ready. And I'm going to talk to you about this more as the week goes on, especially with Judah and especially with Joseph. And I'm going to emphasize to you all the things that God would be teaching me so that I can go, oh, I want V8 moments. I want to be able to know, now I see what God's doing. Now I know what God's doing in my life. Now I've got the right perspective. Okay. I didn't say I like it. I didn't say Joseph liked being in the pit. I didn't say Joseph liked being in prison. I didn't say Joseph liked being falsely accused. I didn't say Joseph liked any of that. But you know what? When he's pulled out of the pit, and by the way, when the word prison is used and he's taken out of the prison after his 13 years there, the word for prison is the word pit. So there's a play on words that God's doing. So everything that took place in this negative scenario that brought Joseph down to the bottom, I'm helping this one boy up at the weight room. His name is Michael. And he has a daughter by the name of Jordan, who is 7 months old. And I told him, I said, you know, the word Jordan means to descend into judgment. And I go, do you know that before you can rise up, you have to descend into judgment? You need to descend down into humility before God will raise you up. Now, some people, they choose not to rise up. Some people choose to just keep going down, 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 down. But the scripture is filled with all types of things to give you hope. But words mean nothing unless I walk it out. And if I walk it out and I anticipate his sweet fragrance, and I'm listening and I'm looking for his fragrance, then guess what? It makes my trip to Egypt much better. Yes, God's with me. Yeah, he's right there. Ask him to open your eyes. He will. So now Pharaoh's got this dream. Nobody in the kingdom can answer this dream. Oh, the butler has a V8 moment. He says, oh, I remember there was this guy in the prison, this Hebrew dude who interpreted dreams. And so now watch what ends up happening whenever Joseph gets taken out of this predicament that he's in. I'm picking up in verse 14, chapter 41, verse 14. Then Pharaoh sent and called Joseph, and they brought him hastily out of the dungeon. Now that word for dungeon, he brought him out of the pit. Just like the pit that he was in when his brothers rejected him. Now, before we go any further, I need to have you think for just a second. One of the challenges that we face, and this is worth writing in your notes, one of the challenges that we face, that we as the reader know more about the story than the characters who are in the story. And you say, what? Let me explain. Joseph, once he was thrown into the pit and abandoned by the brothers, never knew what was going on with his brothers, with Jacob, with the coat, with the goat, with all of the interaction for the next 22 years. Could you imagine his imagination? Could you imagine his father sends him to Shechem to go check on the brothers? And with hindsight, because he said, Hanani, here am I, Father, send me in Genesis 37. Well, the last time somebody said Hanani, it led to some massive suffering. That was Abraham offering Isaac as a korban olah. Here I am, send me. I want you to go to Shechem. Do you remember what happened in Shechem with Simeon and Levi? They killed all of the men of Shechem. It was a bloodbath. Now, the imagination of Joseph, maybe my dad doesn't love me. I mean, he sent me to Shechem, of all the places in Shechem, to go and to check on my brothers. That's nuts. Did he send me? Did he have a plan for me to be kidnapped by my brothers, for them to want to throw me in the pit and me get sold? Could you imagine his imagination? He doesn't know, does he? He doesn't know. He doesn't know what's going on. Like so many situations that you and I find ourselves in. Once an event's taken place and you're removed from the event, you don't know what's going on. You don't know what's going on behind the scenes, but boy, does our imagination run wild. So Joseph is sold. Joseph's put in Potiphar's house. Joseph makes a decision with Mrs. Potiphar, and I'm going to detail this out for you this week. He makes a decision with Mrs. Potiphar where he had his clothes removed the first time by his brothers, and this time he makes the choice to leave his clothes behind and exit stage left. Now I'm going to make a statement for you which is worthy of your notes. And that statement is this: sometimes you need to make it look like you're not being loyal in order to demonstrate that you're truly loyal. What? Sometimes you have to make it look like you're not loyal to truly validate that you're loyal. Huh? Joseph, when he left his coat behind and he fled out of the palace naked, by all means, it looked like he wasn't loyal. But truly, he was loyal. Now, let me explain to you what this looks like today. So listen with your heart open in the deepest way. Sometimes it's more important not to say anything and to have somebody think the worst of you when in actuality you are being loyal to them. I'll say it one more time, because this is not a concept that we grasp very easily. We, speaking of me, myself, and I. My actions may appear not to be loyal, but when the veil is removed, you will see the loyalty was greater than ever before. But the way that you do it is, let's say somebody's accusing you of something that's wrong. Do you know what Joseph didn't do? He didn't say a word. He didn't self-justify because he knew the Lord was with him. He trusted the hand of God to throw him into prison rather than to fight and to self-justify himself. And in time, where he could have thought, my dad doesn't even love me. My brothers hate my guts. My brothers stripped me of my coat. My brothers threw me into a pit. My brothers were responsible for selling me. My brothers didn't care a rippity-doo-dah day about the dreams that I had about them and the dreams that I had about my father and my mother and all my brothers, the sun, the moon, and the stars, the wheat stalks bowing down. They don't give a rippity-doo-dah day. Now look what ends up happening when you understand that all things work together for the good to them who love God, to those who are the called according to his purpose. So beginning in verse 14, he is hastily brought out of the dungeon. He's shaved. He gets new clothes. He comes to Pharaoh. So he's pulled out of the pit. He's washed. He's shaved. He has new garments. He has everything that he lost. Everything. Well, wait a minute. He was thrown into a pit. He was rejected. He was stripped of his clothes. He's thrown into a pit. He's sold. Now he's hastily being removed out of the pit. He's being washed. He's given new clothes. Everything that he lost is now in time being restored. You might be familiar with the passage that talks about the restoration of everything that the locusts have eaten. Now he goes on and says, and Pharaoh said unto Joseph, I've dreamed a dream, and there's none that can interpret it. In other words, do you know what, Joseph? Your dad and your brothers didn't want to hear your dreams. I'm listening to you about dreams. There will come a time where in the areas where you've been rejected, when you know that God always provides the spice, the balm, the myrrh, the sweet fragrance as you're heading to Egypt, there will come a time where the things that you've been rejected in, because you know his presence is with you and you're not allowing your imagination to run and you're not creating scenarios that aren't even true and creating your reality, that God's going to say, okay, I had to get this set up, I had to get that set up, and I had to get that set up. And I put you in an awkward position for a reason, because you have the right mindset. So I brought Pharaoh's dream at the right time. Then he goes on, he says, and there's none that can interpret. And I've heard say of you that you can understand a dream to interpret it. And Joseph answered Pharaoh saying, and pay close attention, because see, the last time that Joseph had a dream, he said to the butler and to the baker, he said, hey, boys and girls, I can tell you all about it. And then when you get out, then let Pharaoh know, hey, I'm the dream maker. I'm the dream interpreter. My brothers call me the master of dreams. My family didn't pay any attention to it, but hey, no. Now this time he says, I have to tell you, it's not in me. It's not about me. He says, God will give Pharaoh an answer of peace. Now what's funny, and that answer of peace is the word shalom. So what's funny about this whole scenario is that Pharaoh tells Joseph the dream, but Joseph doesn't go off into prayer and say, well, let me pray about this. No, immediately, instantaneously, he goes, I've got the dream, because he's connected, and he gives the dream. Now, what we've talked about in years past, and maybe we'll talk about this on a Rev Shabbat or on Shabbat, is that, you see, the first dream that Pharaoh has is about Joseph. The second dream is about the kingdom. So here's a point for your notes. As you're putting into practice all of these truths, there will come a time, and when that time comes, the things that you were confused about, that you thought that you understood in times past, God's going to give you clarity. But he's not going to give you clarity if you've got your imagination running wild, exalting itself against the knowledge of God. Not going to come to you. It's not going to come to you if you don't know that all things work together for the good to them that love God. It's not going to come to you if your goal is not the end of the law for righteousness to everyone who believes. It's not. Mark it down. It's not. Exclamation point. It's not. And this is the condition of the majority of people. I just never get any insights, understanding. Why am I going through what I'm going? Because we've got the wrong perspective. We're creating our own prison cells. It's what we're literally doing. And we let our imaginations run wild. So he goes on and he tells him about the dream. Dream. Joseph says to Pharaoh, the dream of Pharaoh, this verse 25, is one. And God has showed Pharaoh what he's about to do. And then he goes and explains all the dream. And that's great. Verse 32. And for that, the dream was doubled to Pharaoh twice. It's because the thing is established by God, and God will shortly bring it to pass. Now, notice what ends up happening. And this is what we're going to close with for the evening. Picking up in verse 37. And the thing was good in the eyes of Pharaoh. It was tov in the eyes of Pharaoh. Why? Because the word that came from God was now matched with the actions that were spoken of by Joseph. And now Pharaoh recognizes that it's good. Now, here's what you need to understand. Listen very, very carefully with your heart open in the deepest way. You know, Joseph isn't sure about how his dad feels about him. He's not. He doesn't know whether his brothers are remorseful. The brothers don't even know what happened to Joseph. Joseph doesn't know that they took the coat, dipped it in goat's blood, took it to the father, said, Hak or nah, check this out, see who this belongs to. He doesn't know any of that. He doesn't know that his father is constantly mourning for 22 years. He doesn't know that. But his father is. He doesn't know. But because Joseph does have an imagination, this is probably one of the reasons why he never writes home, to be able to say, hi, Dad, I'm in Egypt. I'm now placed second in command by a surrogate father who apparently has replaced you. You rejected my dreams. He wants my dreams. You sent me out to Shechem to find the boys. They threw me in a pit. He took me out of the pit. They stripped me of my clothes. He gave me new clothes. I was sold into slavery. He put me in command. Do you see? Do you see Joseph being conformed through what appears to be the downward steps? But the downward steps with the appropriate mindset were actually elevation of conforming him. And then God takes all of the circumstances around and he says, now I've got Pharaoh in the right spot. I've got the boys in the right spot. I've got 7 years of plenty coming. I've got 7 years of famine coming. Everything's set. Joseph is now elevated to a position, and now picking up here in verse. And then what ends up happening is that not only does he get taken out of the pit, washed, brand new clothes, interprets the dreams, all the things that his father wasn't, by a surrogate father, by another person in his life that fills that void, that pain. And there's more to the story, so we're not done. Pharaoh said unto his servants, can we find such a one as this? Verse 38, a man in whom the Spirit of God is? Can't find another man like this, who the Spirit of God is inside him like this. Nope. This is called, he was 17, 13 years in prison. He's now at the age of 30, the year of the age when a man would go into the priesthood, the age of 30, same time that Yeshua began his ministry, the age of 30. And Pharaoh said unto Joseph, for as much as God has showed you all this, there's none so discreet and wise as you. You shall be over my house, and according unto the word shall all my people be ruled. Only in the throne will I be greater than you. That sounds familiar about Yeshua, doesn't it? And Pharaoh said unto Joseph, see, I've set you over all the land of Egypt. And Pharaoh took off his ring from his hand, put it upon Joseph's hand, arrayed him in vestures of fine linen, put a gold chain about his neck. He made him to ride in the second chariot which he had. They cried before him, bow the knee, and he made him ruler over all the land of Egypt. This should vault you forward into the Apostle Paul's letter in Philippians chapter 2, that at the name of Yeshua, every knee will bow and every tongue will confess that Yeshua, the Messiah, is Lord, something that we will look forward to in a coming day. And then what he does is he says in verse 45, and Pharaoh called Joseph's name Zaphnath-Paneah. He changed his name, and he gave him to wife Asenath, who's the daughter of Dinah, who got raped by Shechem, and the daughter of Dinah got adopted into Egypt. And so then she was spared so that she could be raised up. And now Joseph marries Asenath, who's connected to Jacob, and the family comes together. And so then he ends up having two children, Manasseh and Ephraim. Listen carefully, and we'll finish up with this for tonight. Manasseh. God has caused me to forget. That's what Manasseh means. It's worth writing down in your notes. When you're patient and when you smell the sweet fragrance of the spices, the balm, and the myrrh, in time, because you know all things work together for the good to them that love God, to those who are called according to his purpose. When you know this at the right time, all that you felt that you lost is going to be restored. And when it's going to be restored, it's going to be restored in greater positions than you can imagine. And in the process of that restoration, the things that you wondered about in times past, you didn't let them hinder you. They didn't stop you from remembering that the Lord, he is with you, as we talked about on Shabbat. In chapter 39, and the Lord was with him, 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 and the Lord was with him. I mean, we saw it over and over and over and over and over again. If I stop thinking about that in the midst of the crazy day, then my mind's going to go every which direction. My imagination's going to run wild, and before you know it, I'm going to be exalting walls higher that are going to stop me from my walk. I got to cast those imaginations down so they don't hinder the knowledge, the experiential knowledge from coming into my life. Taking those thoughts captive and presenting them obedient to Christ. So he has two children. Manasseh, God has caused me to forget. Forget what? Forget that my family's rejected me. Forget that I had the pain. Forget that I was in prison. Forget this. Why? When your hope is fulfilled, the pain is gone. And then Ephraim, he's caused me to be fruitful. Listen very carefully. You cannot be fruitful in your life when you're living with the misery of the memories of your past. Ain't gonna happen. Sorry, Charlie, not gonna happen, because you've created these walls. Tomorrow morning study that I'm going to send out to you, I haven't written it. I just prayed about it through the couple of hours that I was there at the cottage. Let's really put forward a big effort in the remaining days of 2024 to be doers of the word. We're going to need it. And now you got to do it more than ever. Because if you can't do it when things are hunky-dory, when the shiitake hits the fan, you're not going to do it. You're going to crater. Time to practice. Time to be disciplined. Time to be loving. Time to be listening. Time to sense the spiceries and the balm and the myrrh in the fragrance of all that you've got going on, and know that he's not stopped working inside of you. He's not. More to come on Friday, but for tonight, we'll have to call it quits.